Using knowledge responsibly. As we grow in biblical knowledge, we are to use this knowledge in a loving, responsible way. Here's Gene.
We know that the Corinthians had written Paul a letter. We don't have that letter, but in his letter back to them, that is the letter we have in the New Testament, which we call 1 Corinthians, he addresses those questions. And the questions come to us really in the terms of slogans, in the form of slogans. And we've looked at a number of these slogans. And by the way, in your Bible, you will find that these slogans are in quotations, which means the translators understood that these were slogans and that these really represented questions that the Corinthians had for the Apostle Paul. Then when you get to Paul's answer or his perspective, you'll see the translators did not put it in quotation marks. So those slogans are set off really in the biblical text. And here, I'm just going to review the slogans. It'll give us a good review. It'll take us back to chapter 6 where we encountered the first slogan. And here it is. Everything is permissible for me. But notice how Paul responded to this slogan here in this first letter. This is, I call, his divine perspective. But not everything is beneficial. Now, you have to keep in mind that there's a context here in relationship to the questions that the Corinthians are asking Paul. And a lot of it has to do with idolatry, has to do with food that is offered to idols. It has to do with views of sexuality. And so Paul is responding. He knows what that context is, and we can discover that context from the rest of the letter. But actually, the slogan is repeated. And here it is. Everything is permissible for me, but notice how Paul gives divine perspective. But I will not be mastered by anything. And if you look at the whole context, you will see that addictions were certainly a part of the Corinthian culture because of their paganism, because of the way in which they indulged in overdrinking. So there were probably alcohol addictions, their sexual behavior. There probably were many sexual addictions that they had, over drinking and immorality. Sexual addictions, if you realize the immorality that existed in this culture before the gospel penetrated that culture. So Paul is simply saying, I will not be mastered by anything. That's a general answer to that question. We go on and we'll find another slogan they used in chapter 6. Food is for the stomach and the stomach is for food. And Paul said, yes, that's true to a certain extent, and God will do away with both of them. In other words, you're going to die. And if you don't eat, you're going to die. But see, they're getting at something more significant when they talk about that particular slogan. And it has to do with sexuality. And basically what they're saying, if we need food to eat, we need sex to live. And Paul is saying later, no, that's not accurate. Sexual appetites and appetites for food are in a different category completely. And they were distorting that. And as we've seen in the study of this letter, coming out of the paganism that they came out of, they were distorting a lot of things in relationship to things that we would take for granted. They just were totally ignorant and totally distorted because of what they were converted out of. So here's another distortion with this slogan going to the opposite extreme. It is good for a man not to use a woman for sex. Now, in essence, what they were saying is, it's good that you don't have sex anymore even though you're married. That's how distorted they were. They're going to the other extreme. And Paul gives a divine perspective, and you'll see it throughout that passage where he makes a statement, sex is God's gift to be used within the bonds of marriage. And he goes on to explain that that gift is a gift from God, but it's to be used according to the way he has created it from the beginning, when he brought Eve to Adam and, of course, introduced us to marriage and to that wonderful gift which God has given, which in Corinth was horribly, horribly distorted. So you have a whole passage there on God's gift of sex within the marriage relationship. Now we come to another slogan here in the passage we're looking at tonight. We all have knowledge. Now, Paul, in essence, says yes, but here's a divine perspective. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. He's not against knowledge, but he's saying if you have knowledge without love, it leads to arrogance, it leads to pride, it leads to all kinds of distortions. And of course, they had a lot of those distortions. And especially since they were living in the Greek and Roman world with all those philosophers, with all of their opinions. But he goes on now to address another slogan, which relates to this slogan about knowledge. And here it is. An idol is nothing in the world. Paul would say, yes. There's no God but one. That's right. However, notice his divine perspective. However, not everyone has this knowledge. Now again, you have to realize what a distorted world these Corinthians lived in and the distortion that surrounded them in terms of paganism. And so Paul elaborates. Again, he says, however, not everyone has this knowledge. What knowledge? That God is one and there's no God but God. He goes on to say, some have been so used to idolatry up until now that when they eat food sacrificed to an idol, their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Now, keep in mind, before we read on in this passage, that food offered to idols basically had three dimensions. They offered food to the idol and actually burned it. In a sense, like in the Old Testament that were their offerings, this was an offering with meat to a pagan idol. So they used some of the meat to offer it to idols, to burn it. But secondly, part of it that they didn't offer was given to people who were eating a meal there in that pagan temple. And that was a time of eating, drinking, having fun, and even sexual orgies that were connected with pagan worship. That's the kind of life these believers were converted out of. And then there was a third way they used the meat that was left over. They would take it out and sell it in the marketplace. So there were three dimensions to this issue. And so Paul is addressing this, and he goes on to say, being weak, their conscience is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We know that. We're not worse off if we don't eat. And we are not better if we do eat in terms of food. Unless you don't eat at all, obviously. But be careful that this right of yours in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak. Now, how would that become a stumbling block to these people who still believe that that idol is a god? Now, remember, he's writing to believers. People put their faith in Christ, but they still are confused that those idols are not gods. I mean, that's how immature these believers were. And that context is important to understand, or we won't understand what he's talking about here. So, he goes on to explain why he is giving these instructions. For if someone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, won't his weak conscience be encouraged to eat food offered to idols? Even if you're eating it there in the temple, within that pagan context, or whether you buy it out in the marketplace and they know it's been offered to those idols, what might happen. So the weak person, the brother or sister from whom Christ died, is ruined by your knowledge. Yes, you know that idol is not a god, but there are some of those believers that were still confused. And so Paul is saying what happens is that this individual literally not only could eat the meat offered to the idol sitting in that temple where the meat has been offered and burned, now it's being served, the leftovers, and they're seeing you drink and get drunk and gorge yourself with gluttony and actually go ahead and participate in sexual immorality in terms of pagan worship. Very quickly they could fall right back in to their sin. That's the context we're dealing with here. Kind of hard for us to identify if we've never lived in that kind of culture. So Paul goes on to say this. Now, when you sin like this against brothers and sisters and wound their weak conscience, you are sinning against Christ. Not just against them, it's against Jesus himself. Therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I'll never again eat meat so that I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. Now, Paul is not saying, I will never eat meat. The context is, I will not eat the meat that has been offered to those idols if it's going to cause my brother and sister to fall. It's an immediate context that he's dealing with. And so consequently, Paul is stating that we must be cautious. And even if we have knowledge, there are those who don't have correct knowledge, and we can cause them to fall or to fail or to commit horrible sin. And in doing that, we're sinning against Jesus. Now, this leads to a question for reflection and response, and that is, why is it important today for Christians to differentiate between what are simply judgmental attitudes and what are true concerns regarding causing another Christian to fall into sin? And the interesting thing about that there are certain religious groups and certain Christians who have their opinions about what's right and wrong, and basically what they say to you is, what you're doing bothers me. And that's not what Paul's talking about. That's a judgmental attitude. I just don't agree with what you're doing, and therefore I don't like it. And you're being a stumbling block to me. Well, being a stumbling block is to cause somebody to sin, to fall into sin, to disintegrate. You see, there are a lot of Christians over the years, unfortunately, and I've been around that and been within it, where we have a weak conscience because of our sinful backgrounds. Therefore, we set up restrictions for ourselves. And then we project that and demand that everybody live up the very thing that we won't do because of our weak conscience. And that's judging. And Paul deals with that in Romans chapter 14 and 15. We're not to judge one another. So here we need to really understand what a stumbling block is. When we become a stumbling block to another Christian, we are causing them to fall into sin and even to self-destruct, to fall back into their pagan lifestyle, to fall back into their addictions, to fall back into very sinful behavior. So that's the context that we're dealing with here. But the fact is, the principle still stands that comes out of this passage. Let me just share that principle once again. As we grow in biblical knowledge, we are to use this knowledge in a loving, responsible way.